June. Now, I made a programme 2 days ago, at the end of which I told you I would try to keep you up to date on any news which has come out from various sources regarding Scotland's cause for liberation. Now, there have been a couple of things which I've been monitoring over the last 2 days. One is the activities of Craig Murray, the former UK diplomat, who is now the unofficial envoy for Scotland at the United Nations. Now, calling him an envoy, he's not really an official ambassador because he doesn't have any formal role appointed by the Scottish Parliament or the Scottish Government, because they're not allowed to do that by the UK government. So Craig has been operating as an independent, I think you would say, an independent kind of ambassador for Scotland at the United Nations, and in particular at the C24 Committee, which deals with decolonisation requests. Now, I reported last time that Mr. Murray had been supporting the efforts of some small nations to be listed for decolonisation, and one of the most notable ones was, of course, New Caledonia, a small former protectorate which is seeking decolonisation as a non-self-governing territory. In other words, it is a country which has been annexed by a larger body or a larger nation, and has been, if you like, remotely controlled by that other nation. Now, Craig is going to be presenting the case for Scotland to be decolonised as well, but the purpose of his recent visit was not solely to help the people of New Caledonia, although that was his primary aim. There was to make contact with the members of the Decolonisation Committee and speak to them on behalf of this small protectorate. In doing so, Craig used the opportunity while he was in New York to make other contacts with other major UN member states. Now, traditionally, the United Nations operates with ambassadors who meet socially. Various countries will hold social events where ambassadors are invited, and they mingle and they chat, they get to know one another, and they discuss matters of, shall we say, common interest between different nations. Now, Craig, although he is retired from the diplomatic corps of the UK, has lots of contracts, and he is well respected as a former diplomat. So it was relatively easy for Craig to become invited to some of these events, including one organised by the UK, which he says he actually gate crashed, using that quotation, that he actually crashed the party that the UK was holding. But he also went to some other social events where he met the diplomats of other major nations. Now, the purpose of Craig's being invited or mixing with these other ambassadors and diplomats was to put out feelers about Scotland's cause, as I mentioned in the previous programme. What I think I hinted at the last time was that Craig had made some sort of tantalising statements that there might be some UN member states who would support Scotland's bid for decolonisation. I can now clarify, and Craig has said this directly in an interview through Scottish Prism, that he has at least one major UN nation, a UN member state, which has apparently said to him that it would support Scotland's bid for decolonisation. Now, Craig isn't able to divulge which of the nations this is, because it's not official. If it were official, then that nation would announce it, and Craig would be able to say it. But at the moment, this is just a chat that they had, possibly at a party or a reception, where Craig put out the idea that Scotland was seeking decolonisation and looking for other nations who might support it. In the process of this, in his lengthy interview through a Scottish Prism, Craig also mentioned the fact that, in his experience at least, and from his contacts in the diplomatic arena, shall we say, across the world, he felt that what he termed the global south, these are the emerging nations, for example, in Southern Africa, in South America particularly as well, such as Brazil, Argentina, so on, that the nations of the global south would support Scotland's bid for decolonisation. Now, he said this as a kind of blanket term. I'm not going to say that this is definitely going to happen, but Craig's impression was that that's where the bulk of the support would come from, as well as from this other unnamed state. Now, having said all of that, a lot of what Craig talked about, he couldn't be specific about because he is not an official ambassador. He is not mandated by the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Government, or the British Government to do any of the things he's been doing. This has been an unofficial visit where he has used his experience to help another small country, and in the process has begun to make contacts with other nations to garner support for Scotland's cause prior to Scotland applying for decolonisation itself. So this is the preparatory work, this is laying the groundwork, making the contacts with the people that you want to support you, and you only need, under the UN rules for decolonisation, one single country, member state of the UN, to support your bid for decolonisation. That's an interesting one. I actually thought it was more than that, but apparently not. Apparently one nation sponsoring your bid is enough. That wasn't the only thing that I was watching over the last few days. Tim Rideout, I'm trying to remember whether Tim is a professor or a doctor, but Tim Rideout is an economist. He's an expert on economics. And he made a very long video where he was explaining why it is necessary for Scotland to have its own currency when it becomes independent, when it's liberated. Now, there are a number of reasons for this, and we all know that during the 2014 referendum, Alex Salmond's position on the currency was to use the British pound after we became independent, because I think at the time he believed that if he did anything else, it would probably put off people like pensioners, older members of the Scottish population, who would be concerned about what would happen to things like their savings or their pensions. However, we all know what happened to that, because during an argument, shall we say, or a discussion with Alistair Darling during one of the televised debates, Alistair Darling actually asked the question outright, which currency would you use? Mr. Salmond said the British pound, because the British pound is a recognised currency, a tradable currency, which any country can use. Except Alistair Darling said, no, you can't. You can't use it, we're not going to let you use the British pound. And at the time, people believed that what he was saying was that you couldn't use the British pound as your official currency, but you could still use the money. But that's actually not quite what Alistair Darling was saying. Now, this is something which is interesting, which came out of Tim's fairly lengthy video. I'd always assumed, like a lot of other people, that the currency issue was a bit of misdirection by Alistair Darling. That in fact we could have used the pound for as long as we wanted to, and that there wouldn't be an issue with that. But there is, and this is something which Tim pointed out that I didn't know, and something which perhaps you don't know either. And that is, it's not just about Scotland being able, with its own currency, to set its own interest rates, to set the value of its own currency, and to be able to trade in a currency of its own. It's not just about that. When you have a bank account in British pounds, as we all do, and we make, shall we say, transactions using phones or credit cards, these are done electronically. And these are done through the Bank of England, because that's the currency issuer for us at the moment. But it's perfectly possible for the British government to instruct the Bank of England to cut off the electronic linkage between the Bank of England and Scottish customers, so that we would not be able to make transfers or anything else in British pounds after independence if the British state were, shall we say, belligerent enough to cut us off. And it is a real threat. They could actually do it. Now, I never thought about it that way. As far as I could see, the threat was to prevent Scotland using the pound as its trading currency, its currency for overseas exports and imports and so on. But I was wrong. It is part of the equation. But if the UK decided, if Scotland was becoming independent, they wanted to cut us off from our own savings, they could do so. They could make that threat real. And that would mean people would have to transfer all of their savings, all of their pensions and all the rest of it from their English bank account, the Bank of England account, into a new Scottish currency account in Scotland somewhere, and they have to do that themselves, otherwise they wouldn't be able to get the money out. That would cause a lot of trouble. Now, when Alex Salmond was asked this question by Alistair Darling about which currency he'd use, and he said the pound, he said, well, you can't. What's your plan B? For some reason, Alex never said, well, we'd start our own currency. He should have, because that's the most natural thing in the world to do. Because when you become independent, you don't want your bank interest rates controlled by a country next door. You want to be able to set your own interest rates, to set the value of your own currency based on the value of your entire economy, what it produces, what it exports, what it imports, and how its internal economy works. And that's what all countries do. So it was an odd thing for Mr. Salmond to stumble over, and I think a lot of people were puzzled by why he never said it, but the effect of it was a tripping point. It was the big stumbling block, which at the point where we were really gaining a lot of traction in the independence campaign and we were pushing towards 50%, it suddenly stopped and the vote dropped back to 45%. So it was a watershed, and it really caused the entire effort of trying to gain independence through a referendum held by the UK to fail. And it's unlikely that such an event will ever be staged again, because it gave the UK a real fright, because they came very close to losing the cash cow. One of the other things which Tim Rideout mentioned, which I think is very important, and I've mentioned it before on this programme, is that a large proportion of Scottish assets, now these are things like our electricity grid, our biggest energy producers, even our whisky manufacturers, the vast majority of these firms, which call themselves Scottish, are actually owned by foreign companies outside the UK. They were sold off effectively by the United Kingdom to international buyers. Basically, other big multinational corporations came in and hoovered them all up. And what that's left us with is very, very few actual, real, domestically produced Scottish firms. Very few. They've almost all gone. They've been basically sold off to multinationals. Tim was pointing out that if you want to be an independent country, then your biggest energy producers, your whisky, your biggest export manufacturers, your food, your salmon, your beef, everything else, all of those things need to be repatriated. And that means those organizations, which have basically been bought up by foreign investors, need to be repatriated. They would need to be bought back or brought back into the control of the Scottish state. Because assets such as water, oil, gas, energy, all of these things are vital. Food as well, obviously. All of the things that are vital for Scottish life belong to other people, or belong to other corporations in other countries. We would have no control over anything that they did. And going counter to what the current SNP policy is of neoliberal, global market-driven investment in Scotland, Tim is saying, no, you can't do that. You need to have all of these essential resources under your own control and in your own ownership, because to do anything else is to give control of your economy to other people. And he's absolutely right. There are so many key businesses and key assets that Scotland has, which we don't own and which we cannot control. We can't control our own energy grid. We can't control the price that we pay for our own electricity or gas. We have no control over the oil and gas industry in the North Sea, it seems. Offshore wind energy has also been largely farmed out to foreign companies who are both building and operating the wind farms, which we don't benefit from. Because although we might buy our energy from them, it comes at extortionate prices, as we all know. So both these men, Craig Murray, former diplomat for the UK, now Scottish envoy to the UN, and Tim Rideout, the expert on Scottish currency. Both of these men have, I think, clarified the situation personally for me, and I'm hoping that by extension for me telling you this stuff today, that they've maybe clarified things a little bit for you. We need to have our own central bank. We need to be able to issue our own currency, and we need to determine what that currency should be the equivalent to. Tim has suggested that when the Scottish currency is created, it would be a Scottish pound essentially, that it should be almost equal to the British pound, basically on par in terms of value, equal to a British pound. Now that would make exchange rates zero. It would mean that all transactions could be conducted directly in the initial years of the new currency. After that, he suggests allowing a little bit of drift. In other words, allowing the Scottish currency to find its own value. And he predicted that the Scottish currency would increase in value as the British pound decreases. He had suggested maybe allowing a variance initially of about 1%, plus or minus, per annum, and then going up to perhaps 5% plus or minus per annum, 10% plus or minus per annum, and then eventually allowing the Scottish currency to find its own value based on the value of the developing economy of Scotland. And all of this is perfectly legitimate, perfectly normal thing to do, the currency. But I think it shows that there's nothing to stop us from issuing our own currency, which can have an equal value to the British pound, which would pose zero problems for anybody with British currency assets, bank accounts, investments or pensions, because those would be completely transferable to Scottish currency. The other interesting thing about Scottish currency is that English currency would still exist, the British pound would still exist, and anyone who didn't want to have their savings or their pensions or anything else denominated in Scottish currency could keep their British pounds if they wanted to. But then they'd have to watch other people who have their savings in Scottish pounds watching their value rise, because that Scottish currency is going to go up in value as the British currency begins to decrease in value. And the British currency has historically decreased in value a lot. It's lost in the last 40-50 years about 75% of its value against, for example, the Swiss, is it a krona? I'm trying to remember, is it the Swiss krona? Anyway, Swiss currency, we'll call it that. It's lost a lot of its value against that over time, over a long period of time, but it's lost it. And it means that the British economy is gradually sinking and its currency is going down with it. However, Scotland on its own, with all of its assets returned and all of these businesses brought back under our control, could flourish. And in flourishing, it's going to increase the value of our currency, which means buying things is going to be easier, especially when you're buying things from abroad. It does, yes, make our exports a bit more expensive, but then we would have control over how much we charge for those. So all in all, the Scottish currency is a brilliant idea. It should be done straight away, even before an independence referendum is held, so that that bank and the connections for cash machines and for electronic transactions is already prepared and ready to be switched on when we need it, because most of our banking in this country is done electronically. Very few of us now use cash a lot of the time. Very small percentage do, but not many of us. So we need to be ready to do both. And as far as Craig Murray is concerned, well, it's interesting now to know, straight from the horse's mouth as it were, that there is another UN member state who, according to Craig, is very recognisable and well known, who does want to help Scotland to be decolonised. All of these things make me feel a lot more optimistic, and also I think the fact that the British state was actually thinking back in 2014 of preventing us from getting access to British currency is staggering, because I really wasn't aware that they could do that. But apparently it's true. Anyway, that's it from me today. I hope you've enjoyed the content of today's programme, and you'll tune in next time. And also that you will obviously like, subscribe and comment to all of these programmes. And if you can, continue to donate when you can. In the meantime, as I always say, keep the faith. Nothing has got worse for us. In fact, the outlook is a lot better than we all imagined. I'll see you soon. Bye for now.